John Anderson's house was modest, but it had all the warmth that made it feel like home. The furniture was simple, the walls adorned with pictures of happier times, and the air always filled with the hum of daily life. It was a life that John had come to accept, a life where every day was about making sure his daughter Emma had what she needed. Yet, it wasn't easy. John's life was marked by hardship, his body worn down by long hours at the construction site. But nothing mattered more to him than Emma. His job as a construction worker kept him away from home for most of the day, often leaving him with little time or energy for anything else. His salary barely covered the bills, and the dreams he once had of giving Emma a better life seemed distant. But John had never been one to complain. He was driven by a single purpose: providing for his daughter and making sure she never felt the weight of his struggles. That evening, after a long day of labor, John returned home, parking his old rusted car in the driveway. He stepped out of the car, looking up at the small house that had been their sanctuary through thick and thin. The sight of Emma playing in the backyard lifted his spirits, as it always did. Despite the exhaustion weighing him down, the sight of her joyful face made it all worth it. She was his motivation, his reason for persevering. "Emma," John called out as he approached the back door. "It's time for dinner, kiddo." Emma ran toward him with a bright smile. "Daddy, look! I drew a picture for you," she exclaimed, holding up a crayon drawing of their house. John smiled, his heart swelling with pride. He bent down to take the picture, his fingers brushing against the rough paper. "It's beautiful, Emma, thank you." The two of them entered the house together, and the familiar smell of dinner filled the air. Simple but comforting food. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They sat down at the table and shared a quiet meal, with John savoring the warmth of his daughter's company. In those moments, he felt like he had everything he needed. After dinner, they were relaxing in the living room, when suddenly they heard a knock at the door. It was a sharp, insistent knock, one that sounded out of place in their quiet neighborhood. John glanced at Emma, who looked up at him with wide eyes. "Who could that be?" Emma asked. John stood up, his curiosity piqued, and walked to the front door. As he opened it, he was met with an unexpected sight. A young girl, looking lost and uncertain, stood on the doorstep. She was around Emma's age, with wide, uncertain eyes and a nervous expression. Her clothes were simple, but there was something about her demeanor that seemed out of place. She looked like she had been walking for hours. Hi," the girl said softly, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know where I am. I think I'm lost." John's heart went out to the girl. She looked around, unsure of what to do next. Her hands were clasped tightly together, and her face was pale, as though she had been walking aimlessly for too long. "Don't worry, sweetheart," John said gently. "Come inside. You look like you could use some rest." The girl hesitated for a moment, but then stepped inside the house, relief washing over her face. Emma, still sitting on the couch, looked up at the girl with wide eyes. "Who's this, Daddy?" Emma asked. John smiled warmly at Emma. "She's lost, sweetheart. She needs our help." The girl stepped into the living room, and John motioned for her to sit down. "What's your name, kiddo?" "Sophie," the girl replied softly, sitting on the couch, her shoulders slumped in exhaustion. I don't know how I ended up here. I was at my friend's house, but then I started walking home and I don't know where I am now." John nodded sympathetically as he grabbed a glass of water for Sophie. "You're safe now. We'll help you find your way home. What's your address?" Sophie paused, staring down at her hands. After a long silence, she finally spoke. I don't know. I think it's somewhere near the park, but I'm not sure. My parents are out of town and I don't really know this area very well. I've only been here for a few weeks." John could see the fear and confusion in Sophie's eyes, and it reminded him of Emma when she was younger, so full of curiosity, but also so vulnerable. He took out his phone and started making calls, trying to help Sophie figure out where she lived. But as he spoke to a few people, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper behind Sophie's lost state. There was a sadness in her eyes that spoke volumes. a sense that she wasn't just lost in the physical sense, but perhaps emotionally as well. As they waited for more information about her address, John turned to Sophie. "Are you okay? Do you want to talk about it?" Sophie hesitated, looking down at her lap before slowly nodding. "I don't know why I'm telling you this, but I don't feel like I belong here. My parents are always working, and I don't have many friends. I feel so alone." John listened carefully, his heart aching for the girl. He knew what it felt like to be overwhelmed, to feel isolated, but he couldn't imagine going through that as a child. He reached out and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone, Sophie," he said softly. "We're here for you. You don't have to go through this by yourself." Sophie looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and relief. For the first time that evening, her shoulders relaxed, and she allowed herself to feel safe. As the evening progressed, John made sure that Sophie was comfortable while they worked on finding her home. He gave Emma a quiet nod, signaling that they'd be taking care of the situation. Sophie seemed to slowly calm down, but John knew that the events of the night were far from over. He couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter would lead to something bigger, something that would change their lives forever. While they waited for more details, John reflected on his life, how he had struggled, how much he had sacrificed, and how, despite everything, he still found the strength to help others. Little did he know that this seemingly small act of kindness was about to set off a chain of events that would alter the course of his life in ways he could never have imagined. The night was falling fast, and the house, once filled with the quiet hum of evening life, now carried a sense of anticipation. John sat with Sophie at the kitchen table, a cup of warm tea in front of her, while Emma busied herself with her toys in the corner. The house was small, but it was filled with warmth, not just from the heating system, but from the kind of genuine care that John had for anyone who needed help. As Sophie took small sips from her cup, John made a few more calls. His phone buzzed again, and this time he felt a pang of relief. The person on the other end of the line had finally tracked down Sophie's address. It was just a few miles away, and he could take her there after a little more rest. "Looks like we've got your address, Sophie," John said, setting the phone down. He noticed how tired Sophie appeared, how her shoulders were slumped with exhaustion. "How about you take a little nap while we figure out how to get you home?" Sophie nodded, looking up at John with gratitude. "Thank you, really. I don't know what I would have done without your help." John smiled warmly. "It's no trouble at all. Everyone needs help sometimes." As Sophie moved to the couch to rest, John returned to the kitchen. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down, taking a moment to reflect on the events of the evening. Sophie's vulnerability struck him deeply. She wasn't just a lost girl, there was something more. He had seen that look in her eyes before, that sense of abandonment that many people, especially children, tried to hide behind masks of bravado. John had felt that loneliness himself at times. He often worked long hours without much company, and it wasn't just his body that grew tired, but his spirit. He knew the weight of carrying a burden by yourself. Emma came over and sat beside him, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Daddy, do you think Sophie's okay?" she asked quietly. John looked down at his daughter, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "I think she will be, sweetheart. Sometimes, people just need a little help to get back on their feet." Emma nodded thoughtfully, before adding, "She seems nice. I hope she's not too lonely anymore." The purity of Emma's words struck John deeply. She had such an innocent view of the world, one untouched by the harsh realities that often made people close themselves off. For a brief moment, John wished he could keep Emma in that state of innocence forever. But he knew that life would challenge her just as it had challenged him. Soon after, Sophie stirred on the couch. Her eyes fluttered open, and she sat up, looking around. "I'm sorry," she mumbled. "I didn't mean to fall asleep." John stood up and approached her with a warm smile. "No need to apologize. You needed the rest." He gestured toward the front door. "We're ready to take you home whenever you're ready." Sophie nodded, rubbing her eyes. "Thank you so much for everything," she said again, her voice soft. "I can't believe how kind you've been to me." John simply shrugged. It's what neighbors do. Now, let's get you home." The drive to Sophie's house wasn't long, but the silence between John and Sophie was thick with unspoken thoughts. John stole a glance at Sophie as they drove. She seemed distant, lost in her own thoughts. He wondered what her life was like, why a young girl like her seemed so lonely. John had no way of knowing, but his instinct told him there was more to Sophie's story than just being lost on the streets. As they neared Sophie's neighborhood, John was surprised to see how different it was from his own. The houses were large and well-maintained, with manicured lawns and high fences that separated them from the outside world. It was a far cry from the modest, close-knit community John had lived in for years. Sophie pointed to a large white house with a winding driveway. "This is it," she said, her voice a little shaky. "This is where I live." John pulled the car to the curb, his heart racing for reasons he couldn't explain. The house looked impressive, perhaps even intimidating. It seemed so out of place compared to the simple life he had built with Emma. He knew that people who lived in places like this had their own set of problems, but it was hard to imagine Sophie fitting into such a world. She looked so small in front of that grand house. "Are you sure you'll be okay?" John asked softly, his eyes meeting Sophie's. Sophie smiled faintly, nodding. "I'll be fine. Thank you for everything, really." John hesitated for a moment, then offered her a reassuring smile. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. You're not alone, Sophie." Sophie's eyes glistened for a brief moment as she nodded. "Thank you." Just as she was about to step out of the car, the sound of an engine revving behind them made both John and Sophie turn around. A sleek, luxury car pulled up to the driveway, the kind of car that John had only seen in magazines or parked in front of mansions. The car came to a stop just behind the old sedan John was driving, and the driver's side door opened. Out stepped a man in a sharp suit, his face partially obscured by the tinted windows of the car. Sophie's expression changed immediately. Her face went pale, and she stiffened in the seat. John furrowed his brow as the man approached, a look of recognition flashing across his face. The arrival of the luxury car marked the beginning of a new chapter in the story. The man who had just stepped out was none other than Sophie's father. However, there was something about the situation that didn't sit right with John. The man's arrival seemed hurried, as if he had been watching the situation unfold from a distance. Sophie, too, seemed to be bracing herself for something. This moment set the stage for the unexpected revelations to come. Sophie's family wasn't just wealthy. They were part of a world John had never known, a world of secrets, expectations, and hidden burdens. The man in the suit walked toward the car with an air of authority, his steps brisk and purposeful. His presence seemed to fill the space, overshadowing the modest setting in which Sophie had found solace for the past few hours. John, still sitting in the car, instinctively reached for the door handle. He was about to step out and greet the man, but something about the situation made him pause. There was an unspoken tension in the air, thick enough that even Sophie, who had been so calm moments earlier, was now visibly unsettled. Sophie's grip on the seat tightened, and she stared ahead, her face pale. Her lips quivered slightly, and her hands fidgeted with the hem of her jacket, as though she were trying to gather the courage to speak. John, noticing her unease, hesitated for a moment before gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for," he said quietly. Sophie turned her head slowly toward him, her eyes filled with silent gratitude. But there was something else behind Thema's deep sadness that she seemed to be carrying. She opened her mouth to say something but closed it again, as if the words she wanted to say were trapped inside. Instead, she simply nodded and then looked toward the approaching man. The man stopped a few feet from the car. His gaze, sharp and calculating, moved from John to Sophie. For a moment, his eyes lingered on her, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he directed his attention to John, his demeanor shifting to one of polite formality. "Thank you for bringing my daughter home," the man said in a deep, controlled voice. His tone was cordial but distant, as if he were acknowledging an inconvenience rather than expressing genuine gratitude. "I trust she's been well taken care of?" John nodded, still unsure of what to make of the situation. "She's fine. She just seemed a little lost and needed help getting back." The man glanced at Sophie, his eyes flickering with something like concern, but it was quickly masked by a sense of cold detachment. Sophie lowered her gaze, avoiding her father's eyes as he spoke to her. "You've caused enough trouble for tonight," he said, his words carrying an edge of frustration. "Go inside." John watched as Sophie flinched at her father's words. It wasn't anger that made her shrink from him, it was something deeper, something that seemed like years of accumulated hurt. Sophie stood slowly, not meeting her father's eyes, and made her way toward the house. She didn't turn back to John, but there was a brief moment when her gaze lingered on him, almost as if she were silently thanking him for the small comfort he had given her, the small sense of safety she had found in his home. After Sophie disappeared into the mansion, the man turned to John, his posture straightening. The tension that had been building in the air now felt almost tangible. John was a little apprehensive, unsure of what to say or how to proceed. The last thing he wanted was to get involved in a family drama, especially with someone as imposing as the man in front of him. "You're John Anderson, I presume?" The man's voice was calm but forceful, and it made John's chest tighten. "That's right," John replied, trying to keep his tone steady. "I live just a few blocks away." Sophie seemed lost, so I helped her find her way home. The man nodded slowly, his eyes scanning John as though he were assessing his worth, trying to read him. There was a silence between them, and John felt his palms start to sweat. He had no idea why this man, a stranger to him, seemed to be scrutinizing him so intently. "I'm Charles Thornton," the man said after a beat. "I appreciate your assistance with Sophie, but I would advise you to be more careful in the future. We don't exactly welcome strangers poking around our private matters." John frowned, his protective instincts rising. "I wasn't poking around," he replied firmly. "I just saw a kid who needed help, that's all." Charles's eyes narrowed slightly at John's words, and for a moment, John felt as though he had said something wrong. But then Charles simply nodded, his gaze softening, just a little. "You're right. I suppose I misjudged the situation," he said, his voice losing some of its edge. "I'm just protective of my family, especially when it comes to Sophie. She's been through a lot." He hesitated for a brief moment before adding, "I hope you understand." John didn't know what to make of Charles's sudden shift in tone. One moment, he seemed like an impenetrable wall, and the next, he was offering an explanation. But there was still something about him, something in the way he spoke and carried himself, that made John uneasy. He could tell that the man was hiding something, and that made him wary. "I understand," John said, though he wasn't sure if he truly did. "I just want to make sure she's okay." Charles took a step back, then nodded curtly. "She's fine. And again, thank you for your help." He turned toward his car, signaling the end of the conversation. "Good night, John." John watched him walk away, still uncertain about everything that had just happened. He had helped Sophie, yes, but now he was left with more questions than answers. Sophie's father seemed like a man of wealth and power, but there was a vulnerability about him, an unspoken tension that John couldn't ignore. Sophie, too, seemed to be carrying a weight that wasn't immediately obvious, but it was there, hanging in the air. Later that night, as John sat at his kitchen table, his thoughts kept drifting back to Sophie and the strange encounter with her father. He tried to focus on his work, but his mind was consumed by the thought of her, the sadness in her eyes, the way she had clung to him for just a moment before disappearing into the cold, imposing mansion. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to Sophie's story than he had been told. The sudden appearance of her father, the tension between them, none of it seemed to add up. Sophie's words kept echoing in his mind, particularly the part about feeling lonely despite being surrounded by people. It was a feeling John knew all too well. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, the sound of a car engine rumbled outside. He looked out the window, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw the same luxury car that had dropped off Sophie earlier. But this time, it wasn't just driving past. It stopped in front of his house. John's instincts kicked in. He stood up and walked toward the door, curiosity gnawing at him. Whoever was in that car, they had a reason for coming back. Was it Sophie? Or was it someone else? Someone with a different agenda? Before he could open the door, the car door swung open and out stepped someone he had not expected. A woman, elegantly dressed, her face partially obscured by dark sunglasses. She had an air of authority similar to Charles, but there was something about her that made John's pulse quicken. John opened the door slowly, his gaze fixed on the woman standing outside. The luxury car idled in the driveway, its sleek, dark surface gleaming under the porch light. The woman was tall, her posture impeccable. Her outfit was sophisticated, a tailored black coat, polished heels, and a pair of sunglasses that obscured much of her face. Her presence was striking, and for a moment, John felt a sense of apprehension he couldn't quite explain. She tilted her head slightly as she watched him, her lips curling into a faint, inscrutable smile. "John Anderson, I presume?" she asked in a voice that was smooth, almost melodic. John nodded, his heart still racing. "Yes, and you are?" "I'm Olivia Thornton," she said, her smile widening just a fraction. "I believe we need to talk." John stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to make of this sudden encounter. Olivia Thornton, Sophie's mother? His mind raced. The woman before him exuded the same air of authority as Charles, and it was now clear that Sophie came from a family not only of wealth but of power too. John had no idea why they were suddenly interested in him, but something about the situation made him uneasy. "I wasn't expecting anyone," John said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Is there something I can help you with?" Olivia stepped forward, her gaze still fixed on him, and for the first time he noticed the glint of something dangerous in her eyes. "I don't believe you fully understand the situation, John," she said, her tone cool but commanding. "We've been watching you." John felt his stomach tighten. "Watching me?" He couldn't hide the shock in his voice. "I don't understand." Olivia smiled again, but this time it was cold, more calculating than kind. "You helped my daughter, Sophie. That was kind of you, but it's not entirely without consequence." John's mind raced as he tried to process her words. "What do you mean?" "I simply gave her a ride home. She was lost." Olivia let out a soft laugh, the sound more unsettling than reassuring. "Oh, I'm sure you think you've done a good deed. But Sophie isn't the only one with a story to tell. You see, we don't just let anyone get close to her." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Especially not someone like you." John's confusion deepened, and he felt a surge of anger rising within him. "I don't understand what you're implying. I didn't do anything wrong." Olivia leaned in slightly, her voice taking on an even more chilling tone. "You're a good man, John. I'll give you that. But people like you, people without the right connections, are often in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that's exactly what's happened here." John's chest tightened, and he struggled to keep his composure. "What do you want from me?" His voice was firm, but his heart was hammering in his chest. Olivia took a step back, crossing her arms over her chest, as if she were examining him. "I'm not here to hurt you, John. Far from it." She smiled again, this time with a more calculating edge. "But I need you to understand that this isn't just about a lost girl and a kind stranger. There's a lot more at play than you realize." John had no idea what to think anymore. His mind was swirling with questions, doubts, and fears. Sophie's sudden appearance in his life had been strange enough, but now her parents were involved, each one seeming more mysterious and secretive than the last. And Olivia was like nothing he had ever encountered before. "What is it that you want?" John asked, his voice quieter now. He didn't trust this woman, not in the slightest, but he had to understand what was really happening. Olivia's eyes softened ever so slightly, as if she were sizing him up. "I want you to stay away from Sophie, John. You've been a good Samaritan, but I can't allow you to get too involved in her life. You don't belong in her world, and I'm afraid you're not the right person to be helping her." John's mind raced as he processed her words. Stay away from Sophie? Why would he? He had helped her because she was lost, because she needed someone, anyone, to guide her. He had no idea what her family was really like, But that didn't matter. Sophie wasn't just another rich kid, she was a person. A young girl who had clearly been struggling. And he had no intention of abandoning her now. Especially not after everything they had been through together. "I don't think you understand," John said, his voice low and steady. "Sophie is a person. She's not some project or something you can control. I helped her because she needed help. I'm not going to turn my back on her just because you say so." Olivia's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake, John, but I'll let you think about it. For now, I'm giving you a warning. Don't interfere with my daughter again, or you'll regret it." She turned to leave, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Before she climbed back into the car, she looked over her shoulder, her gaze cold and unwavering. "You've been warned," Olivia said softly. "Take it as you will." And with that, she was gone. John stood frozen on his doorstep, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. The night had grown eerily quiet again, but his mind was anything but. His heart pounded in his chest as he processed everything that had just transpired. Sophie's mother was clearly not someone to be taken lightly. She was calculating, cold, and used to getting what she wanted. But John wasn't going to back down. Not now. He had promised to help Sophie, and he wasn't going to let her slip back into whatever strange, controlled life her parents were trying to force her into. There was more to Sophie than met the eye, and he knew that now. He had seen it in her eyes earlier. Sophie was lost, not just physically, but emotionally. And that kind of lostness couldn't be fixed by a luxury car, a big house, or threats. As he closed the door, John resolved that no matter what it took, he would find out what was really going on with Sophie. He wouldn't let her go back to a life of silence and loneliness. But there was one thing John hadn't anticipated. Olivia's threat wasn't the only one Sophie would face.